Captain Derek Foss plucked the notebook right out of her hands. He flipped through the pages slowly, deliberately, the way a man performs for an audience. Hydraulic diagrams, pressure flow schematics, actuator stress notations written in pencil so careful it looked like a love letter to engineering. He looked at the pages. Then he looked at her. Then he turned to the two crew members standing behind him and held the notebook up like Exhibit A in a case he had already decided. "Gentlemen," he said, grinning, "our black ramp girl has been doing homework." The laughter came fast, easy. He flipped to another page, tilted his head like he was studying something exotic in a museum. 24 years I've been flying. MIT-trained engineers brief me before every departure." He snapped the notebook shut and held it out at arm's length, dangling it between two fingers like something he'd found on the floor. "And now I'm supposed to take hydraulic advice from someone whose last qualification was learning which bag goes in which bin." More laughter. Louder this time. Zara reached for the notebook. Foss pulled it back 1 inch. Just 1 inch. Just enough. "Tell you what," he said, dropping his voice just low enough to sound generous. "You stick to the heavy lifting, sweetheart. God gave you a strong back. Let's not waste everybody's time pretending he gave you anything else." He tossed the notebook at her chest and turned toward the aircraft stairs. He was 4 steps up the jetway when every hydraulic alarm on that aircraft detonated at once. The laughter stopped like someone had cut the power. This story begins 3 weeks before that staircase, and it ends somewhere no one standing at gate C-14 saw coming. Drop your city and your local time in the comments right now. People across the world are watching this together. Subscribe if you haven't yet. You will want to be here for everything that happens next. Meridian Air occupied Terminal C at Hartsfield-Jackson, like a tenant who had been there so long they forgot they were renting. The signage was clean. The uniforms were pressed. The marketing materials showed smiling faces against blue skies and used words like family and excellence and the people who get you there. From the outside, it looked exactly like what it claimed to be. From the ramp level, it looked different. The ramp was where the work actually happened. Baggage carts, fuel trucks, ground power units, jet bridges that groaned when the weather changed. The air smelled like kerosene and burnt rubber, and the particular exhaustion of people who started their shifts before the sun came up. There were no marketing materials down here. There were no smiling faces in the brochures. There was just the work and the noise and the hierarchy that everyone understood without anyone having to say it out loud. Zara Coleman had been working the ramp at Meridian Air for 22 days. She was 21 years old, 5'4", and wore her hair pulled back tight under a regulation cap that was 1 size too large because the supply room had run out of smalls. Her purple provisional badge hung from a lanyard. Her grandmother had given her dark green with small yellow sunflowers on it, the kind of lanyard that did not belong in an airport, and that Zara wore anyway, because her grandmother had picked it out specifically. The badge itself said 3 things: her name, her photo, and the word provisional in block letters that sat on the plastic like a warning label. She was the only black woman on the morning ground crew. She did not complain about this. She showed up 7 minutes early every shift. She learned the equipment faster than anyone in her orientation cohort. She asked questions that made the senior ramp agents pause before answering, not because the questions were disrespectful, but because they were the kind of questions that revealed the person asking them had been thinking carefully about things they were not required to think about at all. During her lunch break, while the rest of the crew sat in the break room watching highlight reels on their phones, Zara sat alone near the equipment bay with a small brown notebook and a mechanical pencil and drew diagrams. Hydraulic system layouts, actuator positioning charts, pressure flow schematics copied from memory, after spending her evenings reading maintenance manuals she had downloaded for free from an aviation technical library website. The notebook was old. The cover was worn soft at the corners. The first 40 pages were filled with someone else's handwriting, neat, dense, confident, and Zara had been filling the pages after that with her own. Nobody noticed what she was drawing. Nobody asked. Nobody except Captain Derek Foss. Foss had been with Meridian Air for 11 years and in Aviation for 24. He was 53 years old, broad-shouldered with silver at his temples, and the kind of posture that announced itself before he walked into a room. His record was clean. His on-time numbers were among the best in the fleet. He had a commendation from the FAA for emergency procedure execution during a bird strike incident in 2019, framed and mounted on the wall of his office at home. He had a parking spot at the employee lot, with his name stenciled in white paint on the concrete curb. He was the kind of man who had been told he was exceptional for so long that he had stopped being able to tell the difference between confidence and contempt. The first incident happened on a Tuesday morning, 9 days after Zara started. She was on break, sitting in her usual spot near the equipment bay, notebook, open, pencil moving. Foss was walking through the ramp area with the shift supervisor, a man named Gary Pratt, doing a routine walkthrough before a departure. Foss noticed Zara. He stopped. He looked at her for a moment, the way someone looks at something mildly out of place. A chair in the wrong position, a sign hung crooked. Then he turned to Gary without lowering his voice. "Why is the ramp girl drawing pictures during her break, instead of doing her job?" Gary glanced over at Zara, then back at Foss. He gave a small shrug that was not agreement, but was not disagreement either. The shrug of a man who had learned to be very small in the presence of people who were very loud. Zara heard every word. She kept her pencil moving. She had learned early from her grandfather, from the neighborhood, from 100 small moments that added up to one large education, that sometimes the most powerful thing you could do was refuse to let someone know they had landed. So she kept her pencil moving, and she finished the diagram she was working on, and she did not look up until they had walked away. That night, she went home to the apartment she shared with her cousin on the south side of Atlanta. She sat at the kitchen table and opened the notebook to a fresh page. She wrote the date at the top. She wrote 2 sentences underneath it. "He noticed me." Good. Because Zara Coleman had not come to Meridian Air supposed to be invisible. She had come because of the machines. She had come because standing 30 feet from a commercial aircraft on an active ramp was the closest she had ever gotten to the thing her grandfather Earl had spent his entire life being kept away from. And she intended to learn everything she could about those machines, regardless of who laughed, regardless of who looked through her, regardless of what the badge around her neck said she was allowed to be. The notebook in her hands was proof of that intention. It had been proof for 3 weeks. What nobody at Meridian Air knew yet, not Gary Pratt, not the morning crew, not Captain Derek Foss, was that the notebook was also about to become the most important document in the building. But that part of the story doesn't start on the ramp. It starts in a garage in Savannah with a man who taught a little girl that machines tell the truth even when people won't. The second week was worse than the first. On Monday morning of week 2, Zara was running a pre-departure equipment check on a baggage cart when she left her notebook on the workbench near the tool rack. She had been gone 4 minutes bathroom break, quick, efficient, and when she came back, the notebook was gone. She found it 20 feet away. Foss was standing near the aircraft nose with First Officer Ben Calloway and a senior flight attendant named Joanne Marsh holding the notebook open like a prop. He was not reading it carefully. He was performing it. Turning pages with exaggerated slowness, tilting it toward Calloway, pointing at diagrams with one finger, the way a teacher points at a child's drawing on a refrigerator. "Look at this," Foss said. "Pressure flow schematics. Actuator load distribution." He shook his head slowly, smiling. "Our ramp girl has opinions about hydraulic engineering." Calloway looked uncomfortable. Joanne looked at the floor. Foss looked up and saw Zara standing there. He did not look embarrassed. He looked pleased. "This yours?" He held the notebook out. Not offered dangled, the way you dangle something at a dog to see if it will jump. "Yes, sir," Zara said. "You draw all these yourself?" "Yes, sir." Foss looked at the page one more time. Then he looked at her. "You know what the difference is between a diagram and an engineering document?" He didn't wait for an answer. "Credentials. One means something. The other is a hobby." He placed the notebook on the workbench between them, not in her hands. "Stick to the bags, Coleman. The bags need you. The aircraft does not." He walked away. Calloway followed without making eye contact. Joanne lingered for half a second, opened her mouth, closed it, and followed. Zara picked up her notebook. She checked every page. Nothing was torn. Nothing was damaged. She put it back in her pocket and went back to the equipment check. That evening, she documented the incident. Date, time, witnesses, direct quotes. She had started keeping this record on day 4 of the job. She didn't know yet whether she would ever use it. She kept it because Earl had taught her that documentation was the only armor that held up in the cold. The third week brought something worse than mockery. It brought erasure. On a Wednesday afternoon, during a routine maintenance window for Sky Meridian Flight 447, Zara was performing a standard exterior walk-around as part of her ramp duties. The aircraft was a Boeing 737-800 tail number N7741M, scheduled for a 6:15 departure to Charlotte. She was moving along the right side of the fuselage, checking for visible damage when she heard it. A sound, not loud, not dramatic. A faint, high-pitched, intermittent whine coming from the right main gear wheel well. The kind of sound that a person who had not spent hundreds of hours reading hydraulic system manuals would walk right past. Zara stopped. She crouched down. She looked at the actuator assembly on the right main landing gear, the hydraulic cylinder responsible for gear retraction and extension. At the base of the actuator, where the cylinder body mated with the attachment bracket, there was a stain. Small, dark, approximately the diameter of a quarter. She touched it with her gloved finger. Thin, oily, fresh, hydraulic fluid micro-seepage. Active. She knew what that meant. Under static ground pressure, a seep that size was minor. Under the dynamic loads of gear retraction at altitude, the same seep became a fracture, waiting for enough stress to finish the job. She opened her notebook. She sketched the actuator, marked the seep location, noted the sound frequency, the fluid color, the approximate area of the stain. She wrote one word underneath the sketch: verify. The next morning, she filled out a formal maintenance concern report through the official Meridian Air Safety Channel. She described the actuator, the location on the airframe, the tail number, the seep characteristics. She submitted it to her shift supervisor. Nothing happened. 2 days later, she tried again, this time through Priya Anand, a mid-level ground technician who had been at Meridian for 6 years and who was one of the few people on the crew who treated Zara like a colleague rather than furniture. Priya was careful, competent, and well-liked. She read Zara's report, asked 2 clarifying questions, and said she would escalate it directly to Foss's maintenance coordinator. She did. The response came back in 4 hours. Priya found Zara near the fuel depot and handed her a printed copy of the report. In the margin in blue pen, someone had written 3 words: "Not actionable. File it." Below that, in a different hand, was a single additional note. Priya pointed to it without saying anything. Zara read it. Source: provisional ramp staff. No technical standing. She stood with the paper in her hands for a long moment. Then she folded it carefully and put it in her notebook alongside her original sketch. But what happened next was worse than the dismissal. The following morning, Zara arrived at her shift to find a printed copy of her original maintenance report posted on the crew bulletin board near the break room entrance. Her name had been removed from the submitted by field. In its place was the name of a senior ground technician named Phil Garner, a man who had not written a single word of the report, and who, when Zara looked at him across the break room, did not meet her eyes. She went to her locker. She sat on the bench inside. She opened her notebook to the page with the actuator sketch. She read Earl's handwriting on the pages before it. She closed the notebook. She stood up. She went back to work. That afternoon, Flight 447 completed its departure without incident. The gear retracted. The gear extended. Nobody on the aircraft knew about the seep. Nobody in operations knew about the report that had been altered. Nobody knew about the name that had been removed. Nobody except Zara and the aircraft. And somewhere in the wheel well of N7741M, a hydraulic actuator that was still quietly, patiently telling the truth. The garage in Savannah smelled like motor oil and old coffee, and something underneath both of those things that Zara could never name but could always recognize the smell of a place where serious work had been done for a very long time. It was a one-car garage on a dead-end street in the Cuyler-Brownville neighborhood, 3 blocks from the house where Earl Coleman had lived since 1971. The roof had been patched twice. The concrete floor was stained in patterns that told the story of 30 years of engines opened and opened again. A single fluorescent tube ran the length of the ceiling, flickering slightly at the left end, always flickering, never quite failing. Earl had said for 15 years that he would replace it. He never did. To a 7-year-old Zara visiting from Atlanta on summer breaks, it was the most important room in the world. Earl Coleman had enlisted in the United States Air Force in 1969 at the age of 18. He trained as a hydraulic systems specialist and spent 8 years maintaining aircraft at bases in Georgia, Germany, and Japan. He was good at it, better than good. His supervising sergeant once wrote in an evaluation that Earl Coleman could diagnose a hydraulic fault by sound alone and had never, in 4 years of working alongside him, signed off on a system that later failed. That evaluation was one of the documents framed on the garage wall. So was the certificate of commendation from the base commander at Ramstein Air Base. So was the letter of recommendation from a colonel whose name Zara had memorized before she could spell it. And so hanging slightly crooked on the wall above the workbench was a unit citation from the Air Force Logistics Command, dated in Earl's careful hand on a small paper label affixed to the frame, received and framed February 30th, 1987, February 30th. Zara had noticed the date when she was 9 years old and had asked Earl about it. He had looked at the frame for a long moment, then looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read and said, "Some things that shouldn't exist do anyway. Remember that." Then he handed her a wrench and pointed at the engine on the bench and did not explain further. She had thought about those words many times since. When Earl came home from the Air Force in 1977, he applied to every civilian aviation maintenance company on the East Coast. Delta's Ground Operations Division, Eastern Airlines, several regional carriers whose names no longer existed. He had 8 years of military experience, a spotless record, and letters of recommendation that would have opened doors for any other applicant. Every single company turned him down. The rejection letters were polite. They cited hiring freezes, internal candidates' positions already filled. Earl kept every letter in a manila folder in the bottom drawer of the workbench. He never threw them away. He never talked about them much. But Zara found the folder when she was 12 and read every letter, and she understood even then, at 12 years old, what the letters were really saying underneath the professional language. So Earl opened a repair shop. Not aircraft, he couldn't get near those anymore. Cars, lawnmowers, boat motors, industrial equipment. Anything the neighborhood needed fixed. For 31 years, the garage never closed on a weekday. And in those 31 years, the walls filled up. Handwritten diagrams covered every surface. Hydraulic circuit schematics, pressure valve timing charts, actuator load calculations annotated with notes in the margins that read less like technical documentation and more like conversation, as if Earl were talking to the machine, directly explaining things to it, asking it questions. One entire wall was dedicated to aircraft systems, drawn from memory, updated when Earl got access to new technical manuals through a friend at the library. He taught Zara the way his Air Force instructors had taught him, except harder. He would open a system, didn't matter which one, and introduce 3 faults, sometimes obvious, sometimes nearly invisible. Then he would hand Zara a flashlight and say 5 words. Find all 3. Then eat. Zara was 7 the first time. She cried once and found 2. Earl made her a sandwich anyway and said, "You'll get the 3rd one tomorrow." She got it in 6 minutes the next morning before he had finished his coffee. By the time she was 14, she was finding faults. Earl hadn't planted real wear patterns, early-stage fluid degradation, stress indicators that would become failures 6 months down the line. Earl would shake his head and say, "Girl, you're reading things before they happen. That's not mechanics. That's listening." The most important thing he ever told her was not a technique. It was a sentence. 7 words that she wrote on the inside cover of his notebook when he gave it to her. A hydraulic system doesn't lie. It speaks. He said it every time the world pushed back. Every time a customer raised an eyebrow at a young black girl in a garage full of tools. Every time someone suggested she might be better suited for something else. Something less technical, something more appropriate. A hydraulic system doesn't lie. It speaks. Earl died on a Thursday afternoon in October, 2 days before Zara's 16th birthday. Massive cardiac arrest. He was in the garage when it happened. They found him sitting in his chair by the workbench, coffee mug still in his hand, a half-finished diagram of a landing gear assembly on the table in front of him. He left Zara 3 things. The notebook, 40 pages filled with his diagrams, his calculations, his margin notes. A leather tool roll with 17 precision instruments, each one cleaned and wrapped. And a letter that Zara kept folded in the inside pocket of every jacket she owned. She never told anyone what the letter said. But on hard days, and there had been many hard days in 22 days at Meridian Air, she would find a quiet moment and put her hand over the pocket where the letter was folded. Not to read it, just to remember that it was there. Because Earl Coleman had spent his entire career being told he was not qualified for the rooms he deserved to be in. And he had poured everything he knew into a notebook and a garage and a granddaughter who was now standing on a ramp in Atlanta, 30 feet from the machines he had been kept away from his whole life. She was not going to waste that. And somewhere on the other side of the terminal, in a wheel well, no one was watching a hydraulic actuator on tail number N7741M was still seeping, still speaking, still waiting for someone with the ears to hear it. The memo came down on a Wednesday morning and hit the operations floor like a stone dropped into still water. Sky Meridian Flight 447, the Charlotte run, tail number N7741M, had been rescheduled. Departure pushed forward by 2 hours and 15 minutes due to slot availability pressure from the Atlanta Tower. The airline had been negotiating a preferred morning window for 3 months, and the window had finally opened. Nobody at the executive level wanted to miss it. The order came from Thomas Wiles' office. Directly get the aircraft out on the new schedule. No exceptions, no delays. What the memo did not mention, what memos from Thomas Wiles' office rarely mentioned, was what would have to be cut to make that timeline work. Gary Pratt delivered the news to the maintenance coordination team at 7:40 a.m. He stood at the whiteboard in the briefing room and went through the revised checklist with the flat efficiency of a man who had long since stopped asking questions about decisions made above his pay grade. Most items stayed. A few were compressed, and won the hydraulic pressure cycling test, a 40-minute procedure that ran the landing gear system through 6 full extension and retraction sequences under controlled ground conditions, was removed from the pre-departure sequence entirely. "We'll flag it for the next maintenance window," Gary said, capping his marker. Nobody objected. The room moved on. Zara was not in that briefing room. Provisional ramp staff did not attend maintenance coordination meetings. She found out about the cut the same way she found out about most things at Meridian Air, by paying attention to what people said when they forgot she was standing nearby. She was restocking the equipment bay at 8:15 when she overheard 2 of the senior technicians talking near the tool rack. The hydraulic cycling test. Scratched from the schedule. Too tight on time. "It'll be fine," they said. The system checked green on the last cycle. "It'll hold." Zara stood very still with a coil of safety tape in her hands and did not move until they had walked away. Then she went to the notebook. She opened it to the page with the actuator sketch. The SEEP notation. The date. The word verify she had written 3 weeks ago. Below that, in a different session, she had added 2 more lines after her second visual inspection, SEEP area unchanged. Whine frequency slightly elevated. Recommend hydraulic cycling test before next departure. She looked at those 2 lines for a long time. The cycling test was the one procedure that would have caught it. Under 6 full gear cycles at ground pressure, an active SEEP at the actuator base would either stabilize and prove itself minor or expand under dynamic load and trigger the pressure differential sensor. Either way, you would know. Either way, you would have information. Without it, you were flying with a question mark attached to your right main gear. She closed the notebook. She made a decision. The first attempt was direct. She walked to the operations desk and asked to speak with the duty maintenance coordinator, a man named Stan Briley. Stan listened to her for approximately 45 seconds before his eyes moved to the purple badge on her lanyard. He picked up a pen and held it over his clipboard with the patience of a man managing a minor inconvenience. "We've reviewed that actuator, Coleman. It cleared the last inspection." "The last inspection didn't include a full pressure cycle," Zara said. "The SEEP I documented was post-inspection. It wasn't present during the previous cycle window. It developed after." Stan looked at her badge again, then at the clipboard. "I'll note your concern," he said, which meant he would not. She went to Priya. Priya read the updated notebook entry standing in the break room hallway, coffee in one hand. She read it twice. She asked one question. "How active is the SEEP right now?" Zara said she would need another visual to confirm, but that the sound frequency had elevated since her last check. Priya nodded slowly. She said she would take it directly to the maintenance lead, not through the standard channel, directly. 40 minutes later, Priya came back. She didn't say anything at first. She handed Zara a folded piece of paper. Zara opened it. It was a printed copy of the maintenance concern form, her third submission, with a single line written across the top in Foss's handwriting. "Not actionable. Provisional staff has no technical standing to flag airframe systems. Do not resubmit." Zara folded the paper and put it in the notebook. That afternoon, Foss held the pre-departure safety briefing in the main operations room. 31 people attended: ground crew, flight crew, gate agents, 2 representatives from the scheduling office. Zara sat in the back row because provisional ramp staff were required to attend, but not required to participate. Foss ran through the briefing with the confidence of a man who had done this 800 times. He got to the maintenance section and mentioned the hydraulic cycling test had been deferred. Routine. Rescheduled for the next window. No concerns flagged by qualified personnel. Then he clicked to the next slide. It was a photograph. Slightly blurry, taken at an angle, clearly a picture of a picture rather than a scan. But recognizable. A page from a small brown notebook. Hydraulic actuator sketch pressure flow notations, the word verify visible at the bottom. Below the photograph in Foss's presentation font, a single caption. Example of non-qualified personnel attempting technical assessment. The room was silent for exactly 1 second. Then someone near the front laughed. A short sound quickly swallowed. Then another person smiled. Then the moment passed and Foss clicked to the next slide and the briefing continued. 31 people in that room. 31. Priya sat 4 seats from Zara and looked at the table in front of her. The scheduling representatives checked their phones. Gary Pratt studied the wall. Not one person said a word. Zara sat in the back row with her hands flat on her thighs and her eyes on the projected image of her grandfather's notebook. The notebook he had filled across 30 years of being kept out of rooms, exactly like this one. And she did not look away until Foss clicked to the next slide and the image disappeared. That evening, she walked to the CEO's office on the 3rd floor of the terminal building. The receptionist told her Thomas Weil was in a meeting. Zara said she would wait. She waited 40 minutes. At the end of 40 minutes, the receptionist told her Mr. Weil's schedule was full for the rest of the day and tomorrow, and suggested she submit a concern through the standard employee portal. Zara thanked her and left. She wrote one final report that night. Longhand. 2 pages. Actuator SEEP documentation timeline, all 3 prior submissions, the deferred cycling test, the slide in the briefing. She printed it at the FedEx on Thornton Road and hand-delivered it to the safety compliance desk at 7 o'clock the following morning. The officer on duty took the envelope, stamped it received, set it in the inbox. The inbox that nobody checked until Monday. Flight 447 was scheduled for Saturday. Saturday morning arrived clear and cold. The sky over Hartsfield-Jackson was the particular shade of pale blue that appears in Atlanta in late autumn, cloudless, thin, the kind of sky that makes everything on the ground look sharper than usual. The kind of sky that flight operations loved. Visibility unlimited. Winds calm. Perfect conditions for a departure that would run exactly on schedule. By 5:45 a.m., the ramp was already moving. Fuel trucks, baggage carts, ground power units humming in the dark. Gate agents were opening their stations. The first boarding calls of the morning were drifting out of the terminal speakers in that particular recorded voice, calm, professional, utterly indifferent to everything happening below the windows. 218 passengers were ticketed for Sky Meridian Flight 447 to Charlotte. Zara arrived at 5:50 and was assigned to cabin turnaround duty, cleaning the aircraft between the inbound arrival and the outbound departure. Straighten seats, collect debris, reset the lavatory supplies, check the overhead bins. The work that happened in the 30-minute window when the aircraft belonged to no one, and she was allowed inside it without supervision and without anyone watching. She worked quickly and methodically the way Earl had taught her. Front to back, aisle then window. Nothing skipped, nothing rushed. She was in the 4th row when she heard the ground crew outside begin the exterior walk-around on the right side of the aircraft. She stopped. She put down the trash bag. She moved to the right side window and looked down at the wing root. From this angle, at this height, she could not see the actuator directly. But she could see the ground crew member, a young man named Kevin, who had been at Meridian for 3 weeks, less time than Zara, moving along the fuselage with the checklist on his tablet, eyes on the screen rather than the aircraft. He walked past the wheel well in 11 seconds. He did not crouch down. He did not look at the actuator base. He tapped the screen twice and moved on. Zara picked up her trash bag and finished the cabin. By 6:30, boarding had begun. The gate agent made the first call, and the line formed with the particular organized patience of early morning travelers, business class, then families, then the long middle section of economy that moved forward in slow increments. Zara was on the jet bridge level collecting the last of the cleaning supplies when she saw Foss arrive. He came from the crew corridor in full uniform, 4 stripes, captain's cap, the rolling bag with the Meridian air tag that he had carried on 800 departures. He moved through the terminal the way he always moved. Like a man who owned the ground he walked on and expected it to hold. Behind him came First Officer Ben Calloway, keeping a respectful half-step back. Behind Calloway, the 2 senior flight attendants. The crew of Flight 447 assembled and moving toward Gate C-14 with 20 minutes to spare. Zara was standing at the top of the jet bridge stairs with a cleaning caddy in her hands when Foss came through the gate door. She had not planned what happened next. She had planned other things, the reports, the channels, the proper procedures, and all of them had been closed to her one after another with the same patient institutional finality. What happened next was not a plan. It was the last available option presenting itself in real time. She stepped forward. "Captain Foss?" He stopped, looked at her. The expression on his face was the expression of a man who has been interrupted by something he cannot immediately categorize. "The right main actuator on this aircraft has an active hydraulic seep," Zara said. Her voice was level. "I documented it 3 weeks ago. I submitted 4 reports. The hydraulic cycling test was deferred. The seep has been progressing. If you retract the gear at altitude with that actuator in its current condition, you are going to lose hydraulic pressure in the right main circuit." The gate area was not empty. There were passengers in the boarding line, gate agents at the desk, ground crew visible through the windows. Calloway stood 4 feet behind Foss and did not move. Foss looked at Zara for a long moment. Then he turned his head slowly and looked at the people around them. The gate agents, the passengers near the front of the line, his own crew. He let the pause sit there. He let it build. And then he did the thing that Zara had seen him do twice before in smaller rooms with smaller audiences. He performed. He reached out and took the notebook from under her arm. She had been holding it without realizing it had brought it to the jet bridge without consciously deciding to, and he held it up. He turned to Calloway. He turned to the gate area. He let them all see it. "Gentlemen," he said, and his voice carried easily across the quiet of the early morning terminal. "Our black ramp girl has been doing homework." The laughter came from 2 directions at once. One of the flight attendants behind Calloway. A ground crew member visible through the windows who could not have heard but could see the performance and understood its shape. Foss flipped the notebook open, let the pages fall, looked at the diagrams with theatrical patience. 24 years I've been flying. MIT-trained engineers brief me before every departure." He snapped the notebook shut, held it out between 2 fingers. "And now I'm supposed to take hydraulic advice from someone whose last qualification was learning which bag goes in which bin." He placed the notebook on the jet bridge railing, not in her hands. "Tell you what," he said, dropping his voice just low enough to sound generous. "You stick to the heavy lifting, sweetheart. God gave you a strong back. Let's not waste everybody's time pretending he gave you anything else." He turned toward the aircraft stairs. Zara looked at the gate area. 6 ground crew members stood within earshot. She looked at each one. One looked at his shoes. One looked at his phone. One looked at the ceiling. One, a man she had worked beside for 3 weeks, a man whose daughter's name she knew, whose lunch she had covered twice when he ran late, looked at Foss's back and nodded. Once. Slowly. The small, complicit nod of a man choosing the easier side. Foss was 4 steps up the jet bridge stairs when the ground diagnostic system on N7741M activated without warning. The alarm was not subtle. It was a sustained high-frequency tone that came from the aircraft's onboard monitoring system. The hydraulic pressure differential sensor in the right main gear circuit, triggered by a pressure drop that had crossed the threshold for automated alert. The sound punched through the ambient noise of the terminal like something physical. Every head in the gate area turned. Foss stopped on the stairs. He stood there, one hand on the rail, 4 steps up, and turned around slowly. The notebook was still on the railing where he had placed it. The alarm was still sounding. 218 passengers had gone completely silent in the boarding line behind the glass. Zara picked up her notebook from the railing. She did not say anything. She did not need to. The aircraft was saying it for her. The alarm ran for 47 seconds before the ground crew silenced it. In those 47 seconds, the gate area at C-14 transformed. Passengers who had been shuffling forward in the boarding line stopped moving entirely. Gate agents stepped away from their desks and looked at each other across the counter with the particular expression of people who have trained for emergencies and are now deciding whether this is one. 2 ground crew members jogged toward the nose of the aircraft. Calloway came back down the jet bridge stairs and stood at the bottom without speaking. Foss came down 4 steps after him. He did not look at Zara. He looked at the aircraft. He looked at the ground crew moving toward the wheel well. He looked at the diagnostic readout on the ramp crew tablet that one of his technicians was already pulling up. His face had changed. The performance was gone. What was underneath it was not panic. Foss was not a man who panicked, but it was something adjacent to it. The expression of a man who has made a very loud statement and is watching the room rearrange itself around the fact that he was wrong. The boarding was suspended. The gate agent made a brief practiced announcement. Passengers were asked to step back from the line. The aircraft was being held for a precautionary systems check. Thank you for your patience. The recording smooth voice delivering it somehow made everything feel more serious, not less. Zara stood at the top of the jet bridge stairs and did not move. She was still standing there when the woman approached her. She came from the direction of the main terminal corridor, not from the gate area, not from the boarding line. She walked with the unhurried deliberateness of someone who had been watching from a distance and had decided that the moment had arrived to stop watching. She was in her mid-50s, dark-skinned, silver-locked hair, pulled back precisely, wearing a charcoal blazer over a white shirt, carrying a leather document folio under one arm. She had a boarding pass in her hand, economy class window seat, row 24. She had been ticketed on flight 447. She had been standing in the boarding line when Foss took the notebook. She had heard every word. Her name was Dr. Lenora Briggs. She held a doctorate in aerospace engineering from Georgia Tech. She had spent 22 years at the FAA's Aircraft Certification Service before leaving to establish an independent technical consulting firm that contracted with the FAA, the Navy, and 4 regional carriers. She was flying to Charlotte that morning for a consulting engagement and had arrived at the gate 40 minutes early because she was by habit and by training a person who arrived early to things. She had also spent the first decade of her career being told, in rooms full of men who looked nothing like her, that her credentials were impressive, but her instincts were probably the result of enthusiasm rather than expertise. She knew the shape of what she had just witnessed. She stopped in front of Zara. "That was your warning," she said. Not a question. "Yes," Zara said. "How long ago did you first document the SEEP?" 22 days. Lenora looked at the notebook under Zara's arm. "May I see it?" Zara's hands tightened on the notebook before she could stop them. She was aware of it, the involuntary protective reflex. The last person who had asked to see her notebook had held it up like a punchline in front of a gate full of strangers. Lenora saw the hesitation. She recognized it with the precision of someone who had felt it herself in different rooms. "I'm not going to laugh," she said quietly. "And I'm not going to take it. I want to see what you see." Zara held the notebook out. Lenora opened it. She turned pages slowly, but not theatrically. She turned them the way an engineer turns pages, reading each one, pausing at the technical entries, running her eye down the notation columns. She stopped at the actuator sketch. She read the SEEP description, the sound frequency note, the date. She read the word verify. She read the 2 follow-up entries below it. She looked at the submission timeline Zara had written in the margin, 4 reports, dates, and recipients, each one followed by a 1-line outcome. Not actionable. No technical standing. Resubmission denied. Inbox. Monday. Lenora closed the notebook. She looked at it for a moment. Then she opened her document folio, removed a business card, and placed it between the pages near the actuator sketch, not on top, not loose, but placed the way you mark a page you intend to return to. She handed the notebook back. She did not say what the card meant. She did not explain what she was going to do. She looked at Zara for a moment, with the expression of a woman who had spent 30 years watching talent get buried under the wrong badge color, and then she turned and walked toward the gate agent's desk. Zara looked down at the notebook. She could see the edge of the card between the pages. She did not open it yet. Across the gate area, Foss was standing near the aircraft nose with 2 maintenance technicians. His arms were crossed. His jaw was set. The performance was completely gone now. There was no audience left for it, and the aircraft had made its own statement loudly enough that no amount of posture could compete. He was talking in a low voice. One of the technicians was showing him the diagnostic readout on the tablet. Foss's eyes moved once across the gate area and landed on Zara. She held his gaze. He looked away first. At the gate agent's desk, Lenora Briggs had her FAA consulting credentials out and was speaking in a voice too low to carry. The gate agent's expression shifted, the professional composure tightening into something more alert, more careful. The agent picked up the phone. She dialed a 3-digit internal number. Zara sat down on the jet bridge railing with her notebook in her lap, and the alarm still echoing faintly in the architecture of the terminal around her. She opened the notebook to the business card. She read the name. She read the title. She read the firm name and the federal consulting designation printed in small letters at the bottom. She closed the notebook. She put her hand over the pocket where Earl's letter was folded. Something had just shifted in the gate area at C-14, something that could not be unshifted. The aircraft had spoken the way Earl had always said machines would speak when they were telling the truth and no one was listening. And the one person who had been listening for 22 days was now sitting on a jet bridge railing with a business card that was about to open a door that 4 rejected reports had not been able to reach. Foss didn't know it yet, but he was about to find out what happens when the machine you dismissed and the girl you humiliated turn out to have been saying the same thing all along. Special Agent Carl Novak arrived at Gate C-14 at 9:17 a.m. He was 51 years old, lean, with the particular economy of movement that belongs to people who have spent decades walking through facilities where one wrong step costs someone their license. He carried a black briefcase, a digital recorder, and a laminated federal credential that he did not wave around because he did not need to. When Carl Novak walked into a room, the room knew why he was there. Lenora had made one phone call from the gate agent's desk. That was all it took. Novak shook hands with Thomas Weil, who had arrived from his office on the 3rd floor, looking like a man who had been handed a problem he did not yet understand the full dimensions of. Weil was 62, silver-haired, the kind of executive who managed by momentum. As long as the numbers moved forward, he moved forward with them. He was not accustomed to mornings like this one. Foss was standing near the operations desk when Novak entered. He straightened. He put on the expression he kept for authority figures, measured cooperative, the face of a man with 24 years of clean record and nothing to hide. "We believe the diagnostic trigger was a sensor anomaly," Foss said before Novak had asked a question. "The system has been known to produce false positives under cold ambient temperature conditions. We were about to run a secondary check." Novak looked at him for a moment. Then he opened his briefcase and removed a legal pad. "We'll get to that," he said. "First, I'd like to see the maintenance documentation for tail number N7741M. All of it. Last 90 days. Foss's expression did not change. "Of course." Then Lenora spoke from across the room. "I'd also like Zara Coleman present during the technical review." The room shifted. Foss turned his head slowly toward Lenora, then toward Weil, then back to Novak. His voice was careful, but the edges were showing. "With respect, the individual you're referring to is a provisional ramp staff member with no technical certification. Including her in a federal maintenance review would be—" "The individual I'm referring to," Lenora said, "identified the failure your entire qualified crew missed, and she documented it 22 days ago." She held up her copy of Zara's notebook entries, which Zara had allowed her to photograph at the gate. "I want her in the room." Weil looked at Foss. He looked at Novak. He looked at the federal credentials still visible on the table between them. He did the arithmetic that executives do in moments like this, the arithmetic of liability, of exposure, of how many more decisions he could afford to get wrong this morning. "She's in the room," Weil said. Foss said nothing, but his jaw tightened in a way that everyone in the room noticed, and no one commented on. The diagnostic review was conducted in the maintenance bay adjacent to Terminal C, a clean, well-lit space with steel work tables, overhead rigs, and enough precision instrumentation to make the gate area feel like a waiting room by comparison. The right main landing gear actuator assembly had been removed from N7741M and placed on a rolling examination cradle under full overhead lighting. 6 maintenance technicians. Novak with his recorder, Lenora with her reading glasses, Weil standing near the door with his arms at his sides, and Zara still in her work clothes, provisional badge on her lanyard notebook, in her hand standing near the back of the room. Foss stood at the head of the table. He had prepared. He produced the supplier certification for the actuator assembly batch number, material composition installation, date, quality control stamps. Everything clean. Everything documented. The seep that triggered the diagnostic was within manufacturer tolerance at installation, he said. What we're looking at is normal operational micro-weepage consistent with standard service hours. This is a vendor characteristic, not a maintenance failure. My team followed correct procedure at every stage. Novak looked at the documentation. Then he looked at the actuator. Then he looked at Zara. "Ms. Coleman," he said, "walk me through what you found." Foss opened his mouth. Novak held up one hand without looking at him. Zara stepped forward. She did not ask permission. She moved to the examination cradle and leaned in. She looked at the actuator for 30 seconds without speaking. Then she opened her notebook to the sketch she had made 22 days ago and held it alongside the physical component. "This isn't vendor-tolerant seepage," she said. "The fluid migration pattern is directional. It's tracking along the cylinder seam rather than distributing evenly around the seal face. That's consistent with a seating misalignment during installation, not material porosity." She pointed to the actuator base. "You can see the asymmetric staining. The left quadrant of the seal face is dry. The right quadrant has progressive fluid accumulation. That distribution doesn't happen with a manufacturing defect. It happens when the actuator was seated under uneven torque." She opened her notebook to a page of torque specifications. Earl's original notations, cross-referenced with the manufacturer's published values, updated in Zara's handwriting, with the relevant figures for the 737-800 gear assembly. If the installation torque was uneven across the 4 mounting points, the seal face would have compressed asymmetrically. Under static ground pressure, it holds. Under dynamic cycling load at altitude, the low torque side opens. The seep becomes a flow. The flow becomes a pressure drop. And a pressure drop in the right main hydraulic circuit during gear retraction means loss of gear retraction authority, Lenora said quietly, finishing the sentence. The room was still. Novak pulled the installation log for the actuator. He found the maintenance entry. He found the technician's sign-off. He found the torque wrench identification number used during the installation. He cross-referenced it with the tool calibration registry. The wrench had not been calibrated in 16 months. Industry standard required recalibration every 12. The wrench was 4 months overdue. The torque values it had delivered during the installation were unreliable by a margin that matched exactly the asymmetric seating pattern Zara had just described. This was not a vendor defect. This was an installation error compounded by a calibration failure, both under Foss's direct supervisory authority. Novak set down his pen. He looked at Foss, who signed off on the calibration registry for the last quarter. Foss's face went pale, not gradually, all at once, like something had been switched off behind it. "We're not finished," Novak said. He turned to Zara. "You mentioned 2 prior flights. Show me." Foss made his move 40 minutes into the diagnostic review. He had been standing at the edge of the room with his arms crossed, saying less and less as the documentation unraveled around him. And when he finally spoke, it was with the particular desperation of a man who has watched every prepared argument fail and has one card left. "This is orchestrated," he said. Everyone turned. She was coached. He pointed at Zara, then at Lenora. "This woman, Dr. Briggs, she's been in contact with this girl before today. The terminology, the notation format, the way she walked through that actuator analysis. That's not a ramp worker's knowledge base. That's a prepared presentation." He looked at Novak. "You're running a federal review based on the word of a provisional temp who was handed a script." The room waited. Novak looked at Lenora. Lenora looked at Zara. Zara looked at Foss with an expression that had no anger in it, something quieter than anger, something that had been sitting in her chest for 22 days and had run out of places to go. Novak reached across the table and pulled the dust cover off the qualification test rig that sat against the far wall of the diagnostic bay. Every certified aerospace maintenance facility kept one. A standard hydraulic and mechanical systems trainer, not flight grade, but mechanically identical to operational components, preloaded at the start of each test cycle with 3 deliberate faults of varying difficulty. The test was the same one that candidates took to earn their airframe and powerplant certification. The benchmark time for a fully credentialed technician was 90 minutes. "Let's settle it," Novak said. He looked at Zara. 3 faults. Document each one, location, failure mode, corrective action. No assistance, no notes except your own. He paused. "Can you do this?" The room held its breath. Weil stood straighter near the door. 2 of the maintenance technicians exchanged a look. Priya, who had been allowed into the room as a witness at Lenora's request, pressed her hands together in her lap. Foss stood with his chin up, and his arms crossed the posture of a man who has just set what he believes is a trap. Zara looked at the rig. It was a hydraulic trainer variant. She recognized an older generation gear and flight control system, the same mechanical family Earl had kept a partial assembly of in the Savannah garage. Different generations, same language. The same logic she had been reading since she was 7 years old, sitting on a concrete floor with a flashlight, and 5 words echoing in her head. Find all three, then eat. She took off her work vest. She rolled up her sleeves. She picked up a flashlight from the tool rack and a wrench, and she went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with the room around her. 19 minutes. She found the first fault, a fractured retaining clip on the primary pressure valve, positioned to allow normal function at low flow rates but catastrophic bypass at operational pressure. She did not guess at it. She heard it. A faint irregularity in the resistance feedback when she cycled the valve manually, a sensation so subtle that the technicians watching her work could not identify the moment she found it. She simply stopped, opened the valve housing, and pointed to the clip. She sketched it, wrote the failure mode, wrote the corrective action, handed the page to Novak. 31 minutes. The second fault, a reversed flow restrictor in the secondary actuator circuit, installed backward with enough precision that it would pass a visual inspection at every angle except one. She found it by tracing the circuit from the pressure source rather than from the component, following the logic of the system, rather than looking at each part in isolation. Earle's method. Follow the argument, not the words. She documented it, handed the page to Novak. 41 minutes. The third fault was buried deeper than the first two. A stress fracture in the accumulator housing hidden behind the main pressure line, invisible to direct inspection. Most credentialed technicians would have needed to disassemble two adjacent components to access the sightline. Zara found it without removing either one. She smelled it. A faint trace of hydraulic fluid oxidation that did not match the standard wear signature of the other components. The specific chemical note of fluid that had been exposed to microfracture stress cycling, heated by friction at the fracture edges, oxidized at a slightly elevated rate, leaving a signature that was not visible but was present if you knew what you were looking for. Earle had taught her the smell catalog, the same way he had taught her everything else. Not as a trick, as a language. She pointed to the exact location. One of the technicians removed the adjacent line. The fracture was there precisely where she had indicated. She wrote the last page, handed it to Novak. 41 minutes. 3 faults. 3 complete analyses. Novak compared each page to the sealed reference answer key that came with every qualification rig. He read each one without expression. Then he set the papers down and looked at Zara. "Perfect score," he said. "Flat, factual. The record for this test is 44 minutes. Then Zara did something that no one in the room expected. She did not step back. She looked at the rig for another moment, then opened her notebook and pointed to a fourth component, the bypass solenoid on the emergency circuit, not included in the test protocol. "This isn't a planted fault," she said. "But the solenoid coil on the emergency bypass shows resistance inconsistency across the terminal contacts. It will pass every standard test at ambient temperature. At low temperature, below 40 degrees Fahrenheit, which this aircraft would encounter above 22,000 feet, the coil contracts enough to open the contact gap. You lose emergency hydraulic backup." She looked at Novak. "That's not in your answer key, but it's in the rig." One of the technicians checked it, pulled the multimeter, ran the resistance test with a cold spray applied to the coil housing. The contact gap opened at 38 degrees. The room did not applaud. It went the particular kind of silent that happens when a group of people simultaneously revise something they believed about the world. Then the audit began in earnest. Novak's team went through Meridian Air's maintenance records the way a forensic accountant goes through books, not looking for the obvious entries, but for the pattern underneath them. What they found in the calibration registry was not an accident. 9 entries across 13 months showed documentation irregularities dates that did not align with the tool service logs, signatures that appeared on days when the signing technician was recorded as off-duty certification stamps applied to tools that had not physically passed through the calibration station. Foss had not falsified all of them. He had falsified enough. Enough to keep the paperwork clean while the tools drifted out of specification and the aircraft accumulated installations that no one could fully trust. Weil terminated Foss's employment that afternoon. Security walked him out. He carried one box. 11 years of commendations, perfect departure records, and a framed FAA citation. And he left Meridian Air with one box and an escort to the parking structure. His airline transport pilot certificate was suspended pending the outcome of Novak's federal investigation. Without it, Derek Foss could not legally operate any aircraft in United States airspace. Of the 11 aircraft flagged for immediate inspection, 3 were found to have torque-critical installation errors consistent with the calibration failures. All 3 were grounded. The passenger exposure across those aircraft, calculated across the subsequent flight schedules they would have operated, exceeded 600 people. None of them knew how close it had been. None of them knew a 21-year-old woman with a purple provisional badge and her grandfather's notebook had been trying to tell someone for 22 days. In the parking structure that evening, Foss walked past Zara without stopping. He opened his mouth once, standing 10 feet away with his box under his arm. Something crossed his face, not quite an apology, not quite an acknowledgement, not quite anything with a name. He closed his mouth. He looked at the ground. He walked to his car. Zara watched him go. She felt none of the things she had expected to feel. Not satisfaction. Not relief. Something older and quieter than either the specific exhaustion of a person who has been right about something dangerous for a very long time and has finally been allowed to stop carrying it alone. She opened her notebook. She turned to a fresh page. She wrote the date at the top. Then she started writing. 3 days after the diagnostic review, Lenora Briggs called Zara at 7 in the morning. Zara was sitting at the kitchen table in the apartment she shared with her cousin on the south side of Atlanta, drinking coffee and reading an actuator service bulletin she had downloaded from a technical library website. The apartment was quiet. The city outside the window was just beginning its morning noise. She answered on the second ring. Lenora did not spend time on preamble. She had not struck Zara as a woman who spent time on preamble. "I have one open apprenticeship slot," she said. 18 months. The program covers full airframe and power plant certification, written oral and practical examinations. Living stipend of $2,800 per month. Tools provided. You work alongside me on active FAA consulting contracts while you study, which means your classroom is a real facility with real aircraft and real consequences. She paused for exactly one beat. When you finish, you will have federal credentials, a resume entry that no hiring committee in this industry will be able to ignore, and a reference letter from someone who has testified before the NTSB 3 times. Zara sat with the phone against her ear and did not speak for a moment. "Why me?" she asked. Lenora was quiet for a second. When she spoke, her voice had shifted slightly, not softer, but more direct in a different way. "Because 40 years ago, I was standing in a room full of people who looked nothing like me, with credentials they had made me fight twice as hard to earn, and someone looked at my work and said it wasn't enough. And eventually, someone else looked at the same work and said it was exactly what was needed." She paused. "You already have the hands and the eye, Zara. The paper is the last thing. Let's get you the paper." Zara looked at the service bulletin on the table. She thought about Earl's garage. She thought about the 40 pages of his handwriting at the front of the notebook. She thought about the letter folded in the pocket of her jacket, hanging by the door. "Yes," she said. She called Thomas Weil's office that same morning. His assistant put her through immediately a change from 3 weeks ago that was not lost on Zara. Weil offered her a full-time junior technician position at Meridian Air. Competitive salary, full benefits, a proper badge with her name and department, and no red provisional label. He said it with the particular careful sincerity of a man who understood that he owed something and was trying to begin paying it. Zara thanked him. She told him she appreciated it. She told him she was going to decline. "I need to go where I can learn," she said. "Not just where I can work." Weil was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I understand." He said it like a man who had spent 3 days thinking about a 22-day-old maintenance report, sitting unread in a safety inbox, and had reached some conclusions about the kind of institutional culture that produced that outcome. The day before she left Meridian, Priya found Zara in the break room. She was carrying a manila folder thick with papers held closed with a rubber band. She sat down across from Zara and set it on the table between them. "What's this?" Zara asked. "Every incident," Priya said. "Every time he said something, every public moment. I have dates, locations, direct quotes, and in 6 cases names of witnesses who were present." She pushed the folder forward. "I started keeping it at the end of your 2nd week. I should have given it to you sooner." She looked at her hands. "I should have done a lot of things sooner." Zara looked at the folder. She picked it up. She held it for a moment, feeling the weight of 22 days of documented silence. Then she set it back on the table and slid it back to Priya. "Keep it safe for me," she said. "But I'd rather let the work speak." Priya took the folder. She nodded once. Her eyes were bright in a way she was working to control. "It already did," she said. On her last morning at Meridian Air, Zara arrived early the way she always arrived, 7 minutes before her shift, and went to the equipment bay one final time. She stood in the spot where she had eaten lunch alone for 22 days, notebook open, pencil moving. She stood there for a few minutes and looked at the aircraft on the ramp through the bay window. The early light was on the fuselage. The ground crew was moving in the pale distance. The machines were doing what machines do, indifferent, precise, telling the truth to anyone patient enough to listen. She closed the notebook. She put it in her bag alongside Earl's. 2 notebooks, side by side. His 40 pages at the front, the handwriting dense and confident, the diagrams made by a man who had been kept out of every room he deserved to be in and had built a room of his own instead. Her pages at the back, less certain in places, more detailed in others. The handwriting of someone who was still in the middle of becoming what she was going to be. Same language. Same love. One conversation that had started in a garage in Savannah and was not finished yet. 6 months later, Zara Coleman was seated at a workbench in Lenora Briggs's consulting facility in Decatur, Georgia. Her name was on a placard above the bench, not printed, handwritten in Lenora's deliberate script, because Lenora believed that the first time your name appeared above a workbench, it should be placed there by a human hand. She was midway through her A&P certification, top of her cohort, by a margin that had stopped surprising her instructors and started making them ask questions, good questions, the kind that meant they were paying attention. On the morning of her 6-month mark, she received an email from Carl Novak's office at the FAA. It was a formal notification, dry institutional language, the kind of document that does not editorialize. It informed her that the federal safety investigation into Meridian Air's maintenance practices had been concluded. The findings had been published in the FAA's Public Incident Record database. She was cited by full name. Zara Coleman, Provisional Ramp Staff, Meridian Air. Identified hydraulic actuator seepage in tail N7741M 22 days prior to diagnostic confirmation. Identified installation calibration failures across fleet maintenance program. Identified emergency bypass solenoid fault outside scope of formal investigation. Federal document. Permanent. searchable. The kind of record that follows a name through an entire career. She printed it out. She folded it once. She placed it in the notebook behind the last page Earl had ever written on. Then she opened the notebook to a fresh page and went back to work. Somewhere in a parking structure in Atlanta, a man who had laughed at her warning was waiting to find out whether he would ever fly again. Somewhere in a safety database, her name was attached to 600 passengers who never knew they had been protected. And in a workbench in Decatur, a woman was learning to put her name on things that mattered. The machine had spoken. She had listened. And in the end, as Earl Coleman had always said, it would the truth had held. Before the story closes, here is the question worth sitting with. 31 people were in that briefing room when Foss put her notebook on a slide. Not one of them spoke. Not one. So ask yourself honestly, have you ever been in that room? Have you ever been one of those 31, the ones who saw it, knew it was wrong, and looked at the table anyway? Drop your answer in the comments. Drop your answer in. The real ones, not the easy ones. And if this story found you at the right moment, share it with someone whose talent the world hasn't recognized yet. Subscribe if you haven't. The next story is already waiting. Earl Coleman spent his life being kept out of rooms he had earned the right to enter. So he built 4 walls, a concrete floor, and a granddaughter who was paying attention. Zara didn't win because someone finally felt sorry for her. She won because she never stopped being excellent, even when the room refused to see it. Talent kept in silence still speaks. The question is whether anyone is willing to listen. If this story moved you, share it with someone the world has underestimated. And subscribe because the next story doesn't let up either.